Mr. Trump, in this recently released national security strategy, he does make a departure from generations of post-World War II U.S. leaders, more concerned about economic outcomes than principles like democracy. How problematic is that?
I think it's very problematic, but I also think it's not exactly new in the sense that we've been living with this since January 6th, and we've been living with the consequences of it as it relates, obviously, with our trade relationship. Wake up, Canadians. We need to understand what we're dealing with here and the kind of excesses that this rhetoric can give rise to.
Donald Trump's new national security strategy has dropped, and it's creating a political shockwave across Canada. Not because it offers clarity, and certainly not because it strengthens alliances, but because it openly declares that America will discourage collaboration with others and expects countries like Canada to fall in line. This isn't the language of partnership, it's the language of hierarchy, and Canada is no longer pretending otherwise.
The debate erupted after Bob Rae, Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, broke his silence and described the strategy as very problematic. In his view, Trump's approach represents a decisive shift away from the post-World War II American tradition of shared security, collective responsibility, and respect for allies. Instead, the new document reframes national security almost entirely around economic dominance and unilateral advantage. Rae reminds Canadians that this change didn't begin today. Since Trump's return to the White House in early 2025, Canada has been caught in the crosshairs of an increasingly aggressive U.S. posture, from sudden tariff hikes to political pressure ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Now, Trump's written doctrine confirms what many had already sensed. Washington's priority is no longer the stability of its alliances, but the pursuit of its own short-term leverage. And it comes at a moment when Prime Minister Mark Carney is moving Canada toward greater strategic independence, deepening partnerships in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and Latin America. The most striking feature of Trump's strategy is the contradiction at its core. On one hand, it signals that the United States no longer intends to play the same stabilizing role it has held for generations. On the other, it insists that allies should avoid forming new partnerships elsewhere. In simple terms, Washington is saying, "We are stepping back, but you are not allowed to step forward." Rae points out that this mindset undermines decades of trust. Canada, he argues, cannot be expected to remain passive while the U.S. withdraws from its commitments. A country of Canada's size, capability, and global significance simply won't accept an arrangement where it is expected to obey rules that no longer bind the party imposing them.
Rae is blunt. Canada has never been, and will never be, a vassal state, and in 2025 that position is stronger than ever. Canada has emerged as a clean energy powerhouse, a critical minerals supplier essential to global manufacturing, a central part of North America's energy security, and a rising force in AI regulation and digital governance. Under Mark Carney, Canada is deliberately broadening its economic and security relationships, strengthening ties with Germany, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union, and preparing long-term partnerships that situate Canada as a stable, predictable middle power in an increasingly unpredictable world. So when the United States demands that Canada limit its collaboration with these very partners, it directly contradicts the direction Canada has chosen. The answer, politically and strategically, is no.
Rae also highlights the deeper issue. Trump's worldview places pure self-interest above everything, including the interests of America's closest allies. Over the past year, Canada has already experienced the consequences of this approach. Tariffs have been used as political tools, not economic policies. U.S. companies have shifted investments based on political pressure rather than market logic. Trade threats have become routine, even when American industries depend heavily on Canadian supply chains. This strategy may energize Trump's domestic supporters, but it undermines the very alliances that have defined North American prosperity and security for generations.
And, as Rae notes, it creates a world where trust erodes quickly, and where even long-standing partners begin to doubt America's intentions. One of the most contentious parts of Trump's strategy is the call to discourage collaboration with others. For Canada, this doesn't just affect trade, it affects national defense. Ottawa is currently exploring next-generation fighter aircraft beyond the U.S. market, evaluating submarine proposals from Germany and South Korea, and establishing deeper defense ties in the Indo-Pacific. Canada's shift isn't ideological, it's practical. In a world of shifting power, no country can rely on a single partner for every strategic need. Trump's strategy, however, frames such diversification as disloyal. But in Rae's view, any Canadian government with self-respect must defend its sovereign right to choose its partners based on Canada's interests, not America's political cycles. And in 2025, that principle matters more than ever. The strategy also outlines a willingness to support foreign political movements aligned with Washington, even when they conflict with the elected governments of allied nations. This shift raises global concerns, particularly in Europe, where governments worry that the United States under Trump may choose short-term ideological victories over long-term stability. Rae warns that this approach invites chaos. Abandoning Ukraine, undermining European governments, and escalating geopolitical tensions in Asia do not serve the long-term interests of democracies, including the United States itself. In an era of rising authoritarianism, the idea that America would reduce its support for democratic allies is deeply troubling. And this is precisely where Canada emerges as a counterweight. While the U.S. debates its commitments, Canada has doubled down on multilateralism, building bridges in regions that value steady partnerships. The contrast between Canada's approach and Trump's is becoming more noticeable and more consequential by the day. Ironically, Trump's attempt to centralize American power risks weakening it. By pressuring allies, he pushes them into new alliances. By discouraging collaboration, he encourages them to diversify. By demanding loyalty without offering stability, he accelerates the creation of a world where middle powers, Canada among them, act more independently. The result is simple. The more Washington tries to restrict Canada's options, the more options Canada chooses to create. Trump's national security strategy isn't just another policy document. It is a declaration of a new American posture, unilateral, transactional, and willing to place pressure on allies to secure short-term gains. But Canada is no longer operating in that world. As Bob Rae makes clear, Canada will push back when necessary, speak honestly when the situation demands it, and defend its national interests without apology. The question now is not whether Canada can adapt to this new U.S. strategy. Canada already has. The real question is whether the United States understands the long-term cost of alienating its closest partner, and whether Trump realizes that Canada is not the country he remembers from past decades. Canada is charting its own course. Washington can either respect that reality or watch its influence fade as allies look elsewhere.
We begin with news today that the federal government and Alberta seem to be moving closer to a deal that could include the possibility of a BC oil pipeline.
I'm told by a senior government official that, of course, the number one demand of Alberta all along has been a new oil pipeline to northwest British Columbia. I'm told Carney is open to the idea of actually moving forward on this project, and there could be some language in that MOU that actually suggests there's a path forward, that they could maybe lay out how they could get to construction on this pipeline.
Canada just took a step that rewrites its entire energy future. With new C5 nation-building powers, Ottawa is now prepared to grant tanker exemptions on the North Coast, a move that would have been politically unthinkable under Justin Trudeau. And with that single decision, Canada has opened the door for a brand new Alberta to Pacific pipeline that could send Canadian oil directly to Asia, bypassing the United States for the first time in modern history. What we're witnessing is Canada breaking free of old taboos and acting like the energy superpower it has always claimed to be.
Yeah, we're learning that Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith are moving closer to a deal, a grand bargain, if you will, on the province's energy sector. The deal could be in hand in a matter of days, frankly. Both sides are feeling quite positive about where things are at this point in time. They want to have an MOU specifically on what it means for the oil patch and what it can do, what the feds can do to help maybe expand oil exports.
Over the past several days, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have moved unexpectedly close to a memorandum of understanding that could reshape Canada's energy map. The two governments are finalizing a framework that would allow construction of a new pipeline toward the northwest coast of British Columbia, something that has been blocked for years. The breakthrough comes from a broader bargain. Ottawa is willing to consider exemptions to the tanker ban that has locked the north coast since 2019. In exchange, Alberta is being asked to commit to long-term industrial carbon pricing and support for carbon capture infrastructure. This is not a single policy shift, but an entire recalibration of the federal-provincial relationship. For the first time in more than a decade, Alberta and Ottawa are moving in the same direction, and both sides appear confident they are within reach of a deal. British Columbia remains the major obstacle. Its government has signaled deep concerns, and Indigenous consultation will be extensive. Several Liberal MPs from coastal ridings have voiced hesitation as well. But the fact remains, Ottawa is now willing to pursue a Pacific corridor, something that federal politics had long treated as off-limits.
The tanker ban was once treated as untouchable, a permanent wall between Alberta's landlocked oil and the world's fastest-growing energy markets. Under Trudeau, it was more than a policy. It was a political identity. But Mark Carney is governing with a different vision. Instead of clinging to symbolic gestures, he is leaning on C5, the new nation-building legislation that gives Ottawa authority to advance projects of strategic national significance. Exempting tankers under C5 isn't a rejection of environmental values, it's a recognition that a mature country can protect its coastlines while still building the infrastructure needed to sustain a modern economy. Canada is not abandoning environmental commitments, it is abandoning paralysis. That is a crucial difference and a sign that Canada is finally learning how to balance energy security with climate ambition.
The possibility of a Pacific pipeline is transformative because it gives Canada something it has never had: direct access to Asia without going through the United States. For decades, Washington has benefited from a near monopoly on Canadian heavy crude. U.S. refineries are literally built for it. Even now, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, almost 70% of America's imported crude comes from Canada. That dependency has given the U.S. enormous leverage that Donald Trump has tried to weaponize through tariffs, threats, and political pressure. A pipeline to the Pacific would break that reliance. It would open the Asian market, one that is expanding far faster than America's, and give Canada bargaining power it has never enjoyed. The mere possibility already shifts the balance. It signals to global investors that Canada is no longer content to be a captive supplier to a single customer.
Perhaps the most surprising development is the tone from Alberta. After years of antagonism under the Trudeau government, Danielle Smith now describes the relationship with Ottawa as remarkably aligned. Her government believes Carney understands the urgency of unlocking Alberta's resources and the political pressures of Western alienation. That alignment is no small feat. It shows that Carney is not governing as an ideologue, but as a deal-maker, someone willing to negotiate, adapt, and deliver results that work for both energy and climate policy. This collaboration suggests a new model of federalism, one where Ottawa doesn't dictate from above and provinces don't retreat into isolation. Instead, both recognize that Canada needs national-scale infrastructure if it wants national-scale prosperity.
British Columbia remains the most unpredictable part of this story. Its government is deeply protective of the North Coast, and its political base has long opposed tanker activity. Many Indigenous nations in the region also remain skeptical. Their voice will be essential legally and ethically. But even here, the political landscape is shifting. Under C5, Ottawa is asserting that national interest doesn't have to come at the expense of local protection. A case-by-case exemption model forces a conversation rooted not in ideology but in practicality. BC may still resist, but the discussion has moved beyond a simple yes or no. That alone is a dramatic departure from the past decade.
This is the part Washington didn't expect. A Canada with two export corridors, one south, one west, is a Canada that cannot be pressured by tariffs or political theatrics. Trump's strategy of treating Canada as an economic junior partner becomes far less effective if Canada has alternative markets. For years, American officials assumed Canada had no choice but to play by U.S. rules. A Pacific route proves otherwise. The geopolitical implications are enormous. If Canada can export directly to Japan, South Korea, India, or other Asian consumers, it becomes a global player rather than a continental supplier, and the U.S. loses one of its most reliable pressure points.
The bigger picture is not about one pipeline or one exemption. It's about a country demonstrating that it understands its own power. Canada is acting with a level of strategic maturity that has been absent from its energy policy for years. It is showing investors that it is ready to build. It is showing allies that it is ready to compete. And it is showing the United States that friendship does not require one-sided dependence. This is the beginning of a new era in Canadian energy, one defined by confidence rather than caution. Canada has crossed a psychological threshold. By opening the door to tanker exemptions and entertaining a Pacific pipeline, the Carney government has moved the country into a new strategic position. Canada is no longer frozen by its own taboos. It is no longer trapped by a single export route. It is no longer content to let other nations, even the United States, define its limitations. The question now is whether Canada will seize this moment fully or retreat into old habits. The next decisions will determine whether this becomes a turning point or a missed opportunity. But one thing is certain: Washington is paying attention, and so is the rest of the world.
Now, while we can't control what the U.S. does, we can decide what happens here. This is Canada. And we can build the future we want for ourselves. We can get that money back and more.
Canada just delivered its strongest reply yet to Donald Trump's aggressive tariff regime. Prime Minister Mark Carney has unveiled Budget 2025, a sweeping trillion-dollar national investment strategy that he says will take back control of Canada's future, rebuild the country's industrial core, and recover the economic damage caused by U.S. protectionism. And this time, the message is unmistakable. Canada is not waiting for Washington. Canada is acting for itself. At a moment when U.S. tariffs are reshaping North American trade, when global alliances are fracturing, and when economic uncertainty hangs over the country, Carney's budget is more than a policy document. It is a declaration of national resolve. It marks the beginning of a new economic direction designed to protect Canada from external shocks and give the country room to chart its own path. Today, we take you through what happened, why it matters, and how this moment may permanently reshape Canada's economic destiny.
Mark Carney stepped onto the stage in Ottawa with members of his caucus, including newly joined MP Chris D'Entremont, and immediately framed Canada's current moment in historic terms. Nations, he reminded the audience, face rare hinge moments when the future hangs in the balance and when leadership determines whether a country rises or stagnates. For Canada, he argued, that hinge moment is now. Rapid technological disruption is redefining entire industries. The world is becoming more volatile and divided, and the global trading system, one Canada has relied on for decades, is being rewired in real time. Carney delivered the number that set the tone. U.S. tariffs and the uncertainty created by Trump's protectionist policies are expected to cost Canada nearly 2% of its GDP. That translates to roughly $50 billion, about $1,300 taken out of the Canadian economy for every person in the country. He made it clear that while Canada cannot control what the United States does, it can control its response, and that response would be nothing short of transformational.
The centerpiece of his announcement is an unprecedented plan to unleash more than $1 trillion in total investment over the next 5 years. This investment wave will target national infrastructure, energy development, housing construction, transportation networks, healthcare modernization, and the transition to low-carbon manufacturing. The government expects this push to increase national GDP by at least 3.5%. In Carney's own words, that's equivalent to more than $3,500 gained for every Canadian, far more than what U.S. tariffs have taken away. From the proposed high-speed rail line between Toronto and Quebec City to a $50 billion Build Communities Strong Fund to the modernization of outdated hospitals built in the 1970s, Carney's plan is not incremental change, it is a generational rebuild. He framed it plainly: fortune favors the bold, and this is the moment for Canada to act boldly.
It's estimated that U.S. tariffs and the uncertainty that they're creating will cost us around 1.8% of our GDP. Let me translate that. That's about $50 billion lost from our economy, or the equivalent of $1,300 for every Canadian.
Budget 2025 cannot be understood without the broader context of Trump's tariff escalation. During his second term, Donald Trump has expanded tariffs across nearly every major sector: autos, metals, chemicals, agriculture, consumer goods, and advanced manufacturing inputs. For decades, Canada benefited from the stability of the North American trading system, but under Trump 2.0, that stability no longer exists. Corporations are shifting production to the U.S. to avoid penalties. Investment decisions are being delayed or canceled, and long-standing supply chains are under constant political pressure. Canada has already felt the fallout. Stellantis moved Jeep Compass production from Ontario to Illinois. GM scaled back electric van production in Ingersoll. Multiple exporters are facing higher costs and shrinking margins. Carney's government understands the new reality. The U.S. is not going to return to predictable cooperative trade policy anytime soon. The old assumptions about continental integration no longer hold. Budget 2025 is Canada's structural answer to that reality.
Rather than meet American tariffs with retaliation, Carney is executing a very different strategy. He is treating U.S. economic pressure as a catalyst to supercharge domestic investment. His formula is simple and aggressive. If the U.S. takes $50 billion of economic output away through tariffs and uncertainty, then Canada should generate hundreds of billions in new value through nation-building projects. In other words, instead of fighting tariff with tariff, Carney is fighting tariff with growth. The budget's investments are designed to reshape Canada's industrial base from the ground up. Modern transit systems, expanded energy grids, advanced factories using Canadian steel and Canadian lumber, digital public services built on AI, and millions of new homes built with faster methods and cleaner materials. It is an approach rooted in economic sovereignty. It asserts that the most effective response to U.S. protectionism is not escalation, but independence.
The domestic political implications are enormous. For Carney, Budget 2025 is not just an economic plan, it is a defining statement about what kind of country Canada wants to be in an era of global instability. His contrast with the Conservative opposition is sharp. While Conservatives emphasize spending cuts and deficit reduction, Carney is arguing that underinvestment poses a greater threat to the country's long-term stability than higher short-term spending. His message appeals directly to Canadians who feel squeezed by inflation, housing shortages, and slowing economic growth. Carney's repeated line, "We choose Canada," is crafted to tap into a broader sentiment. He is positioning himself as the leader willing to move beyond the old model of relying on U.S. markets and instead build a more self-sufficient, more resilient national economy. It is bold, it is risky, and it signals the clearest break yet between Ottawa and Washington's economic philosophies. In the United States, Trump's advisors will see Budget 2025 as a strategic threat. Over the last year, the Trump administration has tried to use tariffs to force production, jobs, and investment into American territory. Carney's trillion-dollar blueprint undermines that logic.
If Canada succeeds in modernizing its infrastructure, diversifying its trade partners, and building a stronger domestic manufacturing ecosystem, then Washington's ability to pressure Ottawa will decline sharply. Carney is essentially flipping the script. Instead of being squeezed by U.S. policy, Canada may come out stronger, more globally competitive, and less vulnerable to American leverage. That is the opposite of what Trump's team wants, and it will undoubtedly shape U.S. policymaking in the months ahead.
Budget 2025 is one of the most ambitious economic undertakings in modern Canadian history. It treats U.S. tariffs not as a crisis to endure, but as a spark for renewal. It is built on the belief that Canada can outperform the forces working against it, grow faster than expected, and redefine its place in a rapidly changing world. Yet the question remains, will Canadians embrace this scale of ambition? And how will Washington respond if Canada begins to rise as a more independent economic power? The answers will determine whether Budget 2025 becomes a turning point that reshapes Canada's future, or merely the opening move in a much larger confrontation between Ottawa and Washington. Either way, the stakes have never been higher, and the world is watching.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, meanwhile, threw cold water on the idea of a comprehensive deal on autos this week.
So we're going into an approach where we are doing one at a time. But at the same time, we will continue to fight for our auto workers. That's clear.
This week, the name Melanie Joly, Canada's industry minister, has dominated national headlines. Fresh from her trip to Washington, she promised to fight for every Canadian job, declaring that Ottawa would not allow American tariffs to undermine the country's manufacturing backbone. Her tone was calm, but her message carried the weight of defiance. Canada would no longer play defense in a game written by Washington.
Is there any prospect of either reductions in American auto tariffs on Canadian autos or an auto deal of any sort? Is there any prospect of either of those things?
So listen, I won't go into the details of the negotiation. What you heard from the Prime Minister is at this point is we're looking to have a deal on steel, aluminum, and also energy projects. So this is what is being worked on. But we know also that we need one on auto, and we need one on copper, and we need one also on lumber.
North America's economy once moved with the precision of a shared engine. Factories in Ontario fed assembly lines in Michigan, and raw metals crossed the border daily without friction. Then came a political shift that changed the rhythm. The United States turned inward, rewriting its trade rules and forcing every neighbor to adjust. In Washington, new tariffs hit key sectors: steel, aluminum, autos, copper, and softwood lumber, shaking the foundation of industries that had sustained Canada's middle class for decades. What began as a campaign to strengthen U.S. manufacturing quickly became a test of endurance for Canada's export economy. In Ottawa, the response was not loud or reactive. It was strategic. Melanie Joly returned from the White House with a clear message: Canada would adapt. She spoke about protecting every Canadian job, not through retaliation, but through reconstruction. The country would rebuild its industrial base from within, treating Washington's pressure as proof that depending on one market had reached its limit. That moment marked a quiet turning point. The story was no longer about negotiation in the Oval Office. It became about how Canada would rewrite its economic identity when the rules of trade were no longer predictable. While headlines focused on failed talks and stalled auto deals, Joly's team was shaping a broader plan. Her industrial strategy rested on three coordinated pillars: protection, production, and prosperity, each designed to anchor jobs that once floated on the tides of U.S. policy. The first pillar focused on protecting existing industries. Instead of subsidies, Ottawa used public procurement to guarantee domestic demand for Canadian steel and aluminum, ensuring that workers in Hamilton and Saguenay kept their furnaces running despite higher export costs. The second pillar centered on producing new capacity. The federal government directed billions into defense manufacturing, clean energy, and advanced nuclear technology, including the Darlington SMR reactor in Ontario.
Each project aimed to absorb displaced workers and create high-skilled positions that could not be outsourced. Canada's 2025 federal budget confirmed an additional 9 billion Canadian dollars for defense, raising total spending to 2% of GDP, aligning with NATO commitments while securing long-term industrial employment. The third pillar looked outward, attracting investment and talent. By leveraging Canada's vast reserves of critical minerals, nickel, lithium, and rare earths, the plan invited global investors to fund mining and processing projects to serve the EV and technology sectors. Every detail of Jolie's framework reflected a single idea: self-reliance as strategy. Canada was not withdrawing from globalization. It was redesigning its place within it. Ironically, Washington's pressure made that redesign politically possible. As Canada implemented its plan, the effects began to ripple south. American factories that once relied on low-cost Canadian components faced rising input prices. Reports from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in late September 2025 showed that Midwest manufacturers were dealing with delayed shipments and increased transportation costs under the new tariff structure. In Michigan and Ohio, auto suppliers warned that margins were shrinking as raw materials from Canada became more expensive. Yet instead of moving production to the United States, several mid-sized firms renewed contracts north of the border, where stable energy prices and predictable investment policies offered better conditions. Meanwhile, Canadian provinces moved fast. Ontario and Quebec accelerated approvals for new energy and infrastructure projects, from the LNG Phase 2 expansion in British Columbia to the Port of Montreal upgrade. Federal-provincial coordination created thousands of construction and engineering jobs, offsetting the drag from weaker exports. For Washington, this was an unintended consequence. The policy meant to bring manufacturing home had pushed America's closest partner to develop independent supply chains. The result was a reordering of North America's industrial map, not a collapse, but a quiet redirection of flow. By autumn 2025, Statistics Canada reported a 3.3% year-over-year increase in wages and 60,000 new jobs in September alone. The unemployment rate remained high at 7.1%, yet analysts from the Conference Board of Canada describe the trend as a stabilization phase driven by domestic investment rather than exports. The shift was economic, but it also carried political weight. For the first time in years, Canada's growth narrative no longer began with what Washington decided. By October 2025, Melanie Joly had become more than a cabinet minister. She embodied a new kind of Canadian economic leadership, calm, assertive, and grounded in realism. Her call to fight for every job was no longer rhetoric. It had become a framework for rebuilding. The government's defense industrial strategy promised work for welders, engineers, and researchers. Energy expansion through LNG and nuclear projects aimed to meet domestic needs while opening future export routes to Europe and Asia. Infrastructure investments like the Port of Montreal symbolized the shift from reaction to creation. Canada's economic map was changing. Regions once dependent on resource exports were now attracting technology and manufacturing investment. The country's long-standing dependence on U.S. demand was finally being balanced by deliberate diversification. Across the border, the picture looked different. Higher costs and disrupted supply chains were squeezing American mid-tier manufacturers. The Federal Reserve's Industrial Output Report for October 2025 noted a 0.4% decline in auto sector productivity tied to disrupted imports. A policy meant to protect American jobs had instead exposed the deep interdependence between the two economies. The symbolism was unmistakable. A plan built to control a neighbor had sparked that neighbor's independence. As the U.S. turned inward, Canada turned outward. Ottawa chose reconstruction over retaliation, proving that quiet strategy can outperform loud politics. And as 2025 draws to a close, the story is no longer about tariffs or White House meetings. It is about two neighbors moving in opposite directions, one struggling to rebuild through isolation, the other finding strength through adaptation. The paradox is clear.
America's attempt to assert power became the reason Canada found its own. What began as an economic shock ended as an industrial awakening, a moment when pressure turned into purpose and Canada rediscovered the power of building for itself.